Just one day after my husband's funeral, I had to sit again in the ice-cold boardroom of the company the two of us built from nothing. My daughter-in-law, in a tight black dress and cold red lipstick, slid a stack of papers toward me. Sign. This company belongs with someone younger. Her voice rang like nails being driven into my husband's coffin. My son sat with his head down, hands trembling, not daring to say a word. My grandson kept his eyes glued to his phone, not even bothering to look up. I felt like I'd lost my husband, all over again. She smirked. "You can keep the lake house. We'll handle the rest." My throat tightened as I remembered my husband's hands, split and bleeding when he poured the first foundation. They were calling me a burden to the very legacy I helped create. I let out a bitter laugh, set the cedar box my husband left me on the table, and when that lid lifted, no one knew it held the thing that would bury their ambitions and rewrite the Whitmore family's history. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I am Norma Whitmore. I'm 69 years old, and until yesterday, I thought I understood the word family. My husband, Howard, and I built Whitmore & Co., one of the largest private construction companies in Atlanta. We started in a tiny garage out back, clawed our way up with sweat, debt, and the belief that if you build something solid enough, it will outlast you. But today, I've learned some things are built not from concrete or steel, but from lies and greed. The boardroom in front of me was wide and bright, but as cold as an operating room. Each glossy pane of glass reflected the faces of 3 Whitmore generations: me, my son, and my grandson. Howard should have been here, right where the leather chair sat empty at my right. He'd told me once, "When I'm gone, Norma, that seat is yours." Yet here we were, just one day after he was laid to rest beneath an oak in Oakland Cemetery, and people were already sitting here deciding how to erase me from the legacy we made. Jade, my daughter-in-law, sat ramrod straight, eyes blazing like someone about to win a big hand. She didn't cry at the funeral, didn't offer condolences. All through the service, I watched her check her watch, as if counting down to this moment. "You know what's best for the company, don't you?" Jade said softly, voice full of authority. "Caleb will take over where Howard left off. All you have to do is sign here." She spun the folder around and nudged it toward me with a long finger, painted a deep red. I read the bold title, "Transfer of Executive Control and Ownership Shares," and it felt like a sledgehammer to my chest. Caleb, my only son, said nothing. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding mine. I knew that posture instantly, a man being steered by the woman beside him. When he was little, Caleb followed his dad onto job sites, wearing a hard hat twice the size of his head. He once promised he'd carry on, his father's work. But years of indulgence turned that promise into a fading shadow. Now, in front of me, he wasn't the boy who loved building. He was a 49-year-old man, afraid of his own wife. And Mason, my grandson, leaned back in his chair, expensive sneakers propped on the table leg, thumbs flying on his phone. I knew he was texting friends, probably complaining about this boring meeting. He didn't care. He never had. I looked at the 3 of them, my blood, my in-law, my heir, and felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. One day after my husband died, they were planning how to push me aside. No tears, no respect, just calculation and power. "You can keep the lake house at Lake Lanier," Jade went on. Her voice syrupy but so cold it raised the hairs on my arms. "That's a good place for you to retire." The word retire made me want to laugh out loud. I wasn't their employee. I am the one who built the Whitmore name they're living off. I remember those early days. Howard mixing cement, me chasing contracts, both of us with bleeding hands from carrying bricks. Some nights we slept on the bare ground just to be ready to pour at dawn. And now my daughter-in-law tells me to retire like I'm a worn-out appliance to be boxed up. I took a breath and met her eyes. "That's a nice speech, Jade, but you're forgetting one thing." She tilted her head, lips curling. "What's that?" "I'm still alive," I said, calm as steel. A hush swept the room. Caleb flinched. Mason finally looked up from his phone. Jade frowned, but a few seconds later the confidence snapped back into place. "Then live well, Mother," she said. "This company needs new blood. It's what Howard would want." She dared to use my husband's name to justify her ambition. For a second, my chest seized, like someone had ripped open the unhealed wound of the funeral. I had to clench my hands to keep them from shaking. The room felt suffocating. I could hear the clock tick, the dry, cold breath of the vent. Through the glass wall, Atlanta was bright and loud, but inside this room, time had stopped. I didn't sign. I just looked at them, saying nothing, letting the silence mirror back their greed. "We will wait for my attorney," I said, soft but final. Jade's eyes flickered, as if she'd heard a threat but couldn't tell if it was real. "An attorney? This is a family matter, no outsiders." I smiled faintly. "Oh, I think you're the outsider here," Caleb stammered. "Mom, please. We just want what's best for you." I turned to my son. "Best for me or best for the name printed on that transfer?" No one answered. Jade gripped her purse handle. Mason lowered his head. Caleb stared at the floor like a child caught in a lie. I stood and looked at the empty leather chair to my right, Howard's spot. I could almost see him there. Gentle eyes, calloused hand resting on a roll of plans. He once told me that if he were ever gone, I had to be rebar in the concrete. I drew a long breath. It was time. "I'm not signing today. I need to review a few things." Jade sprang up. "Do you not understand the situation? The board will—" I cut her off. "There is no board above me in this company. And remember, Howard wrote that into the bylaws." She went silent. Only the vent kept hissing, like a witness with a cynical smile. I turned and walked out, carrying their anger and contempt at my back. My footsteps clicked across the marble floor, each one a farewell to a family that had died in my heart long ago. 3 days earlier, I'd avoided Howard's office. I couldn't face the emptiness he left: the swivel chair, the engraved pen, the coffee cup with a faint lip mark. But that day, something made me open the door. Light slid through the blinds, dust glowing gold in the air. I quietly straightened the desk, touched the photographs. Howard young on a job. Sight, me beside him with wind lifting my hair. When I pulled out the bottom drawer, I saw a small crack in the floorboard, as if the plank had slipped. I bent down, pressed lightly, and it lifted. Beneath was a small cedar box, old but carefully polished. My hands shook when I picked it up. The scent of old wood, mixed with the lavender Howard always used in that room, made my throat tighten. I didn't open it that day. I only knew, somehow, he'd left me something important. Now, with Jade in front of me trying to seize the company, I set that box on the table. No one knew what it was. But I did. It wasn't just a keepsake from a husband. It was the key to the truth. I ran a finger over the lid and gave a small, knowing smile. "You want to run, Whitmore & Co.?" I said slowly. "Then let's see what Howard left for me." The room went dead silent. No one answered. Only the soft click of the hinge as I lifted the lid, and with that sound, a door to the past began to open. I sat in Howard's office, the room I hadn't dared enter since he died. The cedar box lay in front of me like a living thing, still and quiet but pulsing with something hidden. Afternoon light came through the blinds, laying a strip of old gold sunshine across the desk. I drew a breath and opened the lid. Inside were 3 things: a soft lock of dark brown baby hair tied with a faded pink ribbon, a yellowed birth certificate reading Norma Whitmore Jr., and finally, a sealed envelope in Howard's handwriting with a red wax stamp. I trembled. The name Norma Jr. cut like a blade. I never had a daughter. I opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick and soft, smelling faintly of ink, wood, and tobacco, the familiar scent of the man I'd spent half my life with. Norma, if you're reading this letter, I'm already gone. I'm leaving you a heavy truth, a burden I didn't have the courage to carry into the ground. I read line by line, my hands shaking the ground. Page. The day our baby was born. No, the day our child was born was the day I lost myself. You'd passed out after a hard labor. The doctor said you needed rest. I ran to share the good news with family and friends. When I came back, a young nurse stood there with red eyes. She told me, "Our baby girl didn't make it." The words knocked the breath out of me. I could hear my own heart thud, heavy as a hammer. Howard never told me this. I'd always thought the birth was only a little risky, that our baby had been taken to the nursery for a few hours before coming back. But the truth was we lost our daughter on day one. I didn't know what to do. I went out of my mind, punched the wall, cried like a fool. That nurse Clara stayed with me. She said there was a newborn boy, healthy, the son of a young single mother who was going to give him up. She said if we took that baby, you'd never have to know this loss. In my desperation, I nodded. God forgive me, I agreed. I set the letter down, tears spilling. A draft lifted the edge of the paper like his hand was shaking too. I remembered the first time I held Caleb in the hospital, those dark eyes, that tiny hand gripping my finger. I loved him from that second. I had no idea he wasn't my flesh and blood. I loved Caleb like my own. But Norma, every year that passed, this guilt ate me alive. I tried to tell you so many times, but every time I saw you smile at him, I couldn't do it. You were too gentle, too devoted. You loved him purely, and I couldn't smash that world. But now, seeing how Jade manipulates Caleb, I know my silence is costing us. She doesn't see love, only power and money. She will swallow this company whole. Norma, you must protect our legacy. I won't be there to do it for you. I folded over the desk and cried, the ink blurring under my tears. Howard, the strong, decisive man, had carried this terrible sin for nearly 50 years. I wept not only for losing my husband, but for feeling betrayed by the person I loved most. He gave me a child, but hid a whole lifetime of truth. And now, when I needed him most, all I had were a few pages and a lock of hair. I sat like stone for a long time, until sunset slid past the window. The light turned copper and washed over our wedding photo on the wall. I touched Howard's face in the frame and whispered, "Did you leave me a will or a bomb?" I cried again, but the tears quickly gave way to something else, cold, clear, like the edge of a blade. That night I didn't sleep. I read the letter at least 10 times, each word carving itself into me. In one part, Howard wrote more neatly, as if he wanted to speak right to me. If I could go back, I would still bring that baby home, because without him, you would never smile again. But you need the truth. It's the only thing that can save this family. Save the family? I didn't know what he meant until I read the last line. Find David. I trust him, and trust no one else. I called David Nguyen the next morning. David has been our lawyer and friend for 30 years. He attended Caleb's wedding, spent Thanksgiving at our house, and helped Howard build the company's legal backbone. He picked up right away, voice warm and steady as always. "Norma?" I was just about to come by. "Are you all right?" I couldn't say all right. I only managed, "David Howard left me a letter. A secret." He was quiet a few seconds, then asked softly, "Should I come now?" 15 minutes later, David was at my door. In his 60s now, hair salt and pepper, eyes still sharp. He rested a hand on my shoulder. Firm but kind. "You don't need to say anything yet. We'll read it together." We sat at the table in the slant of morning light. I handed him the letter. David read in silence for a long time. I heard him let out a deep breath. When Howard said, "The truth will save the family," he wasn't wrong, David said quietly. "But for it to save anything, you have to prove it." I looked at him, tears still sitting in my eyes. "What do you mean?" "This letter is a map," he said, voice low. "But a map needs a weapon to go with it. In this case, your weapon is DNA." I froze. The thought scared me. "You want testing?" David nodded. "If we can confirm Caleb isn't biologically related to you and Howard, everything, inheritance, shares, control shifts. Jade will have no cards left." My heart beat faster. But how? After all these years? A thin smile, one I'd seen before in hard legal fights. Hospitals keep records and biological samples for decades. "Caleb had an appendectomy at 8, right?" I nodded. "Then there may still be stored samples. I'll petition for lawful retrieval. And for you, we need a comparative sample from you or Howard." I looked down at the box. "What about the lock of hair? From the baby?" David paused a fana. Beat. Eyes brightening. "If that's your biological child's hair, it could be the key. We'll submit both the baby hair and Caleb's sample to an independent lab." His voice was even and certain, as if reading a sentence on our enemies. I felt fear, but also the faintest lift of hope. "And one more thing," David said, gaze steady. "Howard mentioned a lost girl, your biological daughter." I clenched my hands. "You think she can be found?" "Not easy," he said. "But not impossible. I'll hire a private investigator. We have the hospital, the date, and the nurse's name, Clara. If she's alive, she's the key." I went quiet. Inside me, old pain and new hope collided like two currents. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. David stood, collected the letter, slid it into a file. "I'll handle the legal work, but you, Norma, stay calm. Tell no one, especially Caleb and Jade. If they smell change, they'll strike back." I nodded, steadying my voice. "I understand. For the first time in years, I don't want to believe in family anymore." He laid a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You haven't lost family, Norma. You're finding the right ones." After he left, I sat by the window. Late light fell across our wedding picture. Howard was smiling, and the woman beside him, me, was smiling too, not knowing that smile was built on a lie half a century long. I closed the cedar box and listened to my heartbeat blend with the wind outside. I knew a storm was coming, but this time, I wouldn't run. 2 days later, I drove to a job site on the south side. Not to check progress, just to hear life again. The roar of drills, the clang of steel, the damp smell of concrete in the morning wind. Those sounds make me feel alive. For weeks after the funeral, all I'd heard were cold words: sign, transfer, retire, consolidate shares. Just the language of calculation. But here this was, the sound of real work. The sound of the people who helped us build the Whitmore empire from bare dirt. I parked near the gate, without announcing myself. I put on Howard's old ball cap, the one he always wore on site, and walked in. No one recognized me as the founder, and that was fine. I only wanted to blend into the crowd, breathe the damp air, and watch steel piles sink into the earth like roots for a dream that used to be beautiful. Amid the noise, a young woman's voice cut through, clear, crisp, never domineering. "Hold up. No blame throwing. Let's check the delivery slip before we file a claim." I turned to see a woman in a beige site outfit, hard hat tilted, standing by a flatbed loaded with steel. Big men, dusty shoulders, clustered around her. They were tense and loud, everyone but her. She kept her eyes on the printout in her hand, steady and calm. I moved closer and caught the story. A shipment of steel had arrived in the wrong gauge, off enough to set the schedule back at least a week, which Jade would use as an excuse to cut the community housing section she always hated. But instead of yelling, the woman pointed to a number on the invoice and said gently, "The vendor didn't do this on purpose. We ordered the wrong code. They still have the right gauge in the main warehouse. I'll call and ask for a rush truck on their dime. In return, we won't mark this as a formal fault. Win-win, everyone keeps face." She finished and let the silence sit. The men looked at each other, then nodded. No one argued. A mess that could have turned into a fight was solved clean and warm. I watched her step aside, phone in hand, calling the vendor. Her tone was professional and calm, never raised, even under pressure. I couldn't look away. When she hung up, I stepped closer. "You're Tessa Cole, right?" She turned, surprised, then smiled quickly. "Yes. I'm sorry, and you are?" "I'm Norma Whitmore." Her eyes flashed with surprise, then respect. She took off her hard hat and swiped sweat from her brow. "Mrs. Whitmore, it's an honor. I've heard so much about you and Mr. Howard. You two are the reason I got into this field." I laughed softly. "I thought only old folks still remembered us," she answered, earnest as daylight. "Not true. At Georgia Tech, my professors still pointed to your projects. If you want to know what a solid foundation is, study them," he'd say. Those words warmed me. It had been so long since I'd heard the Whitmore name spoken with reverence rather than as a prize to seize. I walked the site with Tessa. She talked as we went, energized but never showy. "This residential development slipped a couple months behind, but we've recovered about 80%. What's left is the community housing wing, which I'm hoping we can keep." I stopped. "Keep?" I heard that section was slated for removal. She gave a small, bitter smile. "Yes, recommended by the new leadership. They say it's not profitable enough. But I disagree. A construction company shouldn't only build pretty towers for the rich. If the workers don't have a place to live, if the people who build our buildings don't have a safe home, then every bridge and high-rise is pointless." Her words tightened my chest. "Howard told me nearly 50 years ago, if we only build for money, Norma, then our houses are just someone else's graves." Hearing the same truth from a woman my granddaughter's age felt like Howard was nearby, smiling. I watched Tessa speak with the crew. She leaned in when they talked, never cut them off, never folded her arms to show power. When a worker mentioned his child had just had heart surgery and he needed to leave early, she paused to ask softly, "Did the surgery go well?" He nodded, eyes wet. She patted his shoulder. "Good. Head home. I'll reassign coverage." That small moment knotted my throat. For years I'd seen young managers treat workers like numbers. In her, I saw what Howard called the true heart of construction: people first, project second. We sat on a half-cured concrete step to rest. She pulled a set of drawings from her pocket and rolled them out. "This is the community housing block I'm fighting for," she said, voice slower now. "It's costly and the margins thin. But if we finish, more than 40 families will live close to work. They'll save time, save commute money, and their kids will have a safe play area. I believe it's the most meaningful part of the whole development." I studied the plan's small, tidy volumes nested together like a family. She'd selected cost-saving, eco-friendly materials, things I'd championed a decade ago before Jade shut them down for being too slow to pay. I asked, "You know Jade wants this cut, right?" She nodded, eyes bright but firm. "I do, but I still submitted a detailed case to leadership. I don't want to lose what the name Whitmore & Co. used to stand for, something bigger than money." I couldn't say more. I just watched her and saw myself. the Norma in her 20s, telling Howard the same things on a pile of broken brick and wrinkled plans. When I left, the wind carried the smell of cement and dust into my coat. I thought, if Howard were alive, he'd want me to trust this young woman. That evening, I opened the notebook. Howard kept on his desk. On the last page, in a quick scrawl, he'd written, "A company doesn't die when it runs out of money. It dies when it runs out of people who still believe in what's right." I stared at that line a long time, then out the window, where sightlights blinked like falling stars. Something in me woke up, not anger but resolve. Jade may control the board. Caleb may stay silent. But I have Howard's legacy. I have the letter. And now I have Tessa. The girl with clear eyes and hands that touch people before they touch steel. I wrote a few lines in my notebook. March 18th. I met Tessa Cole. She reminded me who I used to be. If Whitmore has a future, it will rest in the hands of people like her. I closed the notebook, feeling lighter. A plan began to form in my head, not just to protect the company, but to protect its spirit. If Howard left me a secret, maybe he also left me a successor. And I knew when the truth comes to light, Tessa will be the most important piece on the board. I returned to Whitmore & Co. and headquarters on Monday morning, just 4 days after visiting the South site. A light rain was falling, the smell of wet earth and damp steel in the air, the scent of a day when something big is about to happen. I sat in the car for a long while, staring at the high-rise glowing under the new Whitmore sign. That name used to make me proud. Now every time I saw it, I felt a crack in my chest. This morning's meeting wasn't on my calendar. It was a special session called by Jade, titled Equity Restructuring and Leadership Succession. I knew exactly what that really meant. A family coup. I walked into the 19th floor boardroom. It was the same as before. Bright, cold, glossy, and heavy with the fake smell of power. Jade was already at the far end of the table, in a perfectly tailored cream suit, blonde hair pinned high, lips painted that blood-red slash. Caleb sat beside her, clutching a folder. My son's eyes were dull, like a man who'd accepted his fate. Mason sat at the end, typing on his phone and chewing gum, his headphones still on. "Let's begin," Jade said, sharp and cool. "Mrs. Norma, I hope there won't be any theatrics this time." I pulled out the chair and sat in my place, the chair that used to be Howard's. I looked straight at her. "You should be careful using that word in another person's house." Jade shrugged, a thin smile at her lips. "I just want to finish quickly. The investment board has agreed. If you sign, Caleb officially becomes CEO, and you," she paused, savoring the moment, "will hold an honorary role, a symbol, no voting power." I leaned back, calm. "No, I won't sign." The room froze. Caleb jerked slightly. Mason glanced up, then down again. Jade smiled. A blade-thin curve. "You're pushing yourself out." "This is a family matter, Norma." I met her stare, my voice low enough to still the room. "No, this was never a family matter." Right then, the wooden door behind me opened. Quiet sound, but in that space, it rang like a verdict. David Nguyen walked in, carrying a worn, dark brown briefcase and a blue file, the color Howard always liked. He nodded to me, then scanned the room with the steady eyes of a man who's stepped into hundreds of courtrooms and never lost. "Sorry I'm late," he said, deep and clear. "But I believe I'm right on time." Jade frowned. "What are you doing here?" "This is an internal meeting of the family and the dog. Executive team." David gave a thin smile. "Wrong, Mrs. Whitmore. This is the formal reading by the lawful executor of Mr. Howard Whitmore's will, and that executor is me." The room held its breath. Caleb's eyes went wide. Mason slipped off his headphones and, for the first time, looked up. I stayed seated, hands on the table, calm as if I'd known all along. Jade laughed a bright, cold sound. You mean the old will, right? We all know what it says. Caleb inherits the company and Mrs. Norma gets lifetime support. That's all. David opened the briefcase, set the blue file in the center of the table. The soft thump of the cover sounded neat and final, like a judge's gavel. No, he said, even and clear. This is the updated will, signed 6 months ago, with witnesses and proper notarization. Mr. Close ad. Whitmore changed the entire inheritance structure before he died. Jade's smile vanished. Impossible. David turned to the first page and read. His voice, steady and ceremonial. I, Howard Whitmore, being of sound mind and judgment, declare this to be my final and sole valid will. I leave all assets, shares, and voting rights in Whitmore & Co. To my wife, Norma Whitmore, and, or to a direct blood heir, if identified. He paused for a beat. The room was silent except for the faint rain against the glass. Jade smirked, reaching for confidence. So that means Caleb. He's the only son. You think a few vague lines will scare us? David didn't answer. He slowly opened the briefcase again and took out a large white envelope sealed with red wax. The overhead lights glinted off the seal like dried blood. He spoke slowly, each word dropping heavy on the table. This is the DNA analysis performed by the state-certified independent genetics lab in Georgia, at the request of the deceased and under my direct supervision. Everyone froze. I looked at Jade and saw a flash of panic, quick as a knife, but I saw it. She cut her eyes at Caleb, signaling, "Don't believe him." Caleb's hands shook. "Mom, what is this?" I only looked at him and said nothing. I wanted them to walk into the trap they'd dug. David set his glasses aside and opened the envelope, sliding out a clipped stack of papers. The air grew thick. No one breathed. Comparative analysis between the biological sample of Mr. Howard Whitmore, retained in medical records at Emory Hospital, and the sample of Mr. Caleb Whitmore. David's voice dropped. Shows the probability of a biological father-son relationship is 0.00%. A sharp, "No way," burst from Jade. Caleb went pale, eyes wide like he'd been shot. Mason's phone hit the floor with a dry crack. Unruffled, David folded the report. I have the originals, certified and sealed. This result is lawful and has already been filed in a contingency court record. Mr. Whitmore wanted this truth read only if necessary to protect his legacy. My lips felt dry, but I stayed composed. This was the moment I'd prepared for. Jade shrieked, thin-voiced. "You're making this up! You're colluding with her! He was out of his mind! No one will believe this!" David laid a hand on the blue file, unblinking. "You can refuse to believe me, but you cannot argue with science. And this," he tapped the file, "is a will effective immediately. Under it, all assets, shares, and voting rights belong to Mrs. Norma Whitmore, or to the true direct heir when identified." Caleb sprang to his feet, his chair clattering back. "No, I am their son. I am a Whitmore. Mom, you can't let them." I cut in, still calm. "Caleb, if you were truly my son, you'd know Whitmore isn't a title you buy with paperwork." He choked on the words and fell back into his chair, hands clutching his head. Jade turned her hatred on me. "You think you've won? You have nothing but age. I'll sue you into the ground." David gave the faintest smile, the kind you give when you've heard a line 100 times. "That's your right. But I'm afraid, as of this moment, you have no legal standing in this building. Interim control reverts to Mrs. Norma Whitmore until the court determines the direct heir." Silence weighed the room down. Outside, the rain struck harder, each drop against the glass like a countdown. I stood and calmly gathered the papers without looking at anyone. "You call this a meeting? To me, it felt like a courtroom and the ruling has been read. I turned to David. "Thank you. I'll need a few minutes alone." He nodded and gestured for me to go first. As I stepped into the hall, the light caught my hand, and Howard's wedding ring flashed. Behind me, I heard Jade fling a cup. The crash was sharp and ugly. Caleb muttered, "No way," like a sleepwalker. Mason slipped out quietly, leaving them in the collapse they'd made. The door closed. I stood in the corridor and listened to the wind. Inside me, there was no triumph, only a cold relief. The storm was breaking, but I knew an undertow was still waiting ahead. I sat back down in the center chair, the air thick as if a giant hand were squeezing the room. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped, each heavy drop on the glass beating a steady rhythm like the heartbeat of a dying room. David opened a second file, his voice deep and clear as a church bell. Next is the result establishing the biological relationship between Mrs. Norma Whitmore and Mr. Caleb Whitmore. He lifted his eyes, scanning each face as if giving one last chance to brace for impact. Then he spoke, each word striking the glass walls like a hammer. The probability that Mr. stayed. "Caleb Whitmore is the biological son of Mrs. Norma Whitmore, 0.0%. Maybe the hardest part isn't hearing the truth, but accepting it without turning your heart to stone. I chose to forgive the husband who hid a lifetime secret, and the child who hurt me to the core. What about you? If you were in that room, would you stay silent, strike back, or forgive? Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know, do you believe mercy is strong enough to hold a family together after a lie? No one breathed, not a sound. The only noises were the soft flip of David's papers and distant thunder outside the window. Caleb looked like the blood had drained out of him. He shot to his feet, hands shaking. "No, no, no, Mom," his voice broke. "Mom wouldn't do something this cruel to me." I looked at my son. Or rather, the man I'd believed was my son. His face was ashen, eyes wet. In that moment, I didn't see a 49-year-old man. I saw the little boy I once rocked to sleep, the child I soothed when he feared thunder, the one I told that kindness is stronger than power. I never stopped loving him, even now that I knew that love had been built on a lie. Jade shattered the silence, screaming, "Forgery! All of it! You staged this to steal the company from us!" She lunged toward David, hand shaking at the envelope. "Give me that! I want the certification!" "This isn't legal!" David didn't move. He simply slid another letter to the center of the table, voice cool. "And this Howard Whitmore's handwritten letter, signed and notarized by Fulton County." He wanted this delivered to Caleb after the reading. Silence again. Caleb took the letter slowly, his hands shaking so hard the edge of the paper trembled. I saw the desk lamp glint off, the tears running down his face. He opened it. I couldn't make out the words, only saw his lips moving with the lines of a dead man. Then a tear fell and smeared the word "forgive." Caleb folded the letter and covered his face. His sobs were quiet but sounded like wind rushing through a deep well. I said nothing. There were no words to soothe this tragedy. Jade still didn't get it or refused to. She turned on David, voice raw. "I'll sue. I'll prove this is fake. I'll call the press. David cut in, voice low and cold. "You can do all of that. But you'll only make Howard's letter public evidence of fraud, abuse of power, and misappropriation." Jade's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked around like someone lost, then to Caleb for support. But Caleb's head was bowed, fists tightening around the letter. "Trust me, Jade," he said hoarsely. "Dad told the truth. He never lied." She stared at him as if betrayed, eyes blazing. "You're as weak as your father. This whole family is insane." She grabbed her purse and shot to her feet. "I don't need to be here one more second." The door slammed. Her heels clicked down the empty hall, then faded. No one followed. No one spoke. Mason, the grandson who'd grown up in silk, stood, slid his phone into his pocket. Not a word to his father. Not a glance at me. Only the blue glow of a screen earlier on his blank face. He opened the door and slipped out. I watched him go and realized his generation stays loyal to money, not people. The door closed again. Only me, David, and Caleb remained. Caleb still sat there, head down, shoulders shaking. I didn't know. Mom, I didn't know. Dad never told me. I thought. I spoke softly. I know. You didn't know. But now you need to understand that the truth isn't here to destroy you. It's here so you can choose who you want to be. He lifted his eyes, red-rimmed. But who am I if I'm not your son and dad's? The question cut my heart. From today on, you're still Caleb, the man I raised, taught, and loved. Blood doesn't decide everything. Your actions do. He looked at me a long time, then gave a small nod, but in his eyes I saw collapse a man who'd lost a father, a mother, and himself in a single morning. David placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet cue. I drew a deep breath. Read the humanitarian clause, David. He nodded and opened the will again. His voice was slower now, lighter, but every word carried in the heavy air. I, Howard Whitmore, ask that when the truth is revealed, my wife Norma will not let hatred cloud her kind heart. I require that a portion of assets, equal to 10% of Whitmore & Co.'s annual net profits, be dedicated to a humanitarian fund for workers, widows, and children orphaned by workplace accidents. This fund will be named the Norma Foundation and overseen directly by my wife. I believe if she is still who she was, kindness will be the final foundation that keeps the Whitmore name standing. My throat tightened. Even gone, Howard was teaching me not to turn to stone in anger. I turned to Caleb and said gently, "Do you hear that? Those are your father's words. He still believed in mercy." He bowed his head, tears hitting the wood. "Dad is better than all of us." David closed the file. "Mrs. Norma, everything is clear. Control, voting. Rights, assets, they're yours. But I believe what he wanted wasn't a victory, it was awakening." I nodded, voice rough. "I know. And maybe the cruelest part is realizing awakening always comes too late." The room was still bright, but no longer brilliant. Light streaked across the table like the shadows of people leaving. I stood and gathered Howard's wedding ring from the table, the one I'd taken off before the meeting began. Now I knew he was still here. In every line, every breath, every right decision I still had to make. Caleb rose, voice breaking. "Mom, can you forgive me?" I set my hand on his shoulder. "I never hated you. But you need to learn to forgive yourself first." He hung his head, tears falling. I turned to David, voice small but firm. "Register the humanitarian fund today. As for the company..." I paused, looking out where the rain had stopped, evening light turning the Whitmore & Co. sign to gold like a new promise. "I'll find someone with enough heart to carry it forward." David nodded, his eyes softening. I think Howard would smile. I was quiet. Inside, a strange calm settled. Because I understood some wounds don't need bandages. They need time and mercy. The air in the boardroom after David finished the humanitarian clause still felt as heavy as old smoke. No one spoke. Only the wind moaned at the glass, and gray light crept over the Whitmore & Co., plaque like a cold reminder that the empire had just been shaken. David cleared his throat and opened the final section of the will. His voice was low, gentle, but each word rang. "To Caleb Whitmore, the son I loved as my own. I leave you a basic annual stipend." to be dispersed only after you complete a mandatory course of psychological therapy within 12 months and cut all legal and financial ties with Whitmore & Co. until an independent board deems you fit for reinstatement." The room went dead still. Caleb lifted his eyes, red and wet. "My father really wrote that?" David nodded. "In his own hand. Not to punish you, to pull you back from the woman who dragged you down." I looked at my son, heart heavy. Howard never lost faith in him, he only wanted to force him to face himself. A man who'd lived so long under someone else's control, he no longer knew his own will. David paused, then went on. "As for Mrs. Jade Whitmore having no legal standing with the estate, no blood relationship, and for acts of manipulation, falsification, and abuse of company assets, she is excluded from all inheritance. No severance, no equity, no brand rights." The last line hit like a hammer on stone. Jade shot up, her face drained, then flushed with rage. "What? Not a cent? Say that again, David." David stayed calm, folding the papers, his voice dropping lower. "I'm reading exactly what your husband wrote. He knew you'd react like this. That's why he lodged a copy with the court. You can sue, but the result won't change." Jade slammed her hand on the table, the room trembled. "This is a setup. He's dead." "How dare you claim he wrote that?" "Because I have witnesses," David said, voice steel flat. "2 people signed with him at the city notary. They're alive, and one is a retired judge." Color chased itself across Jade's face, shock, fury, despair, then a harsh, frayed laugh. "Fine, I'll sue. I'll drag Norma's name through the press. They'll say she tricked her husband, ruined her son, destroyed a family." I looked at her. Steady. "Which family, Jade? The one you bought with contracts and shares? Or the one you turned into a ladder?" She clenched her fists and stepped toward me. "You think you've won? You're old, you won't beat me. I have lawyers, media." And David stood, his voice so cold and sharp it cut the air. "You may have all that, but right now, you have no legal standing in this building." He nodded, toward the door. "I've called security. They'll escort you from the executive floor." "You wouldn't," Jade screamed. The door opened. 2 security staff walked in. Without a word, they approached. Jade struggled, her heels clacking hard on the marble. The sound was cold and needle-sharp, like the last cut of someone who'd lost everything and was still slashing at shadows. She whipped around and screamed, "Caleb, don't just stand there. Say something. You'll let them humiliate me?" Caleb didn't move. His eyes were empty, staring through her into nothing. He said nothing. He didn't flinch. Only Howard's letter in his fist, crumpled to wrinkles. Jade looked around, desperate. Coward. Useless. She cried one last time, voice cracking, and the guards guided her out. Her heels faded, then stopped as the door clicked shut. Silence fell heavier than any sound before it. I looked at Caleb. His face was gaunt, as if he'd aged 10 years in 1 hour. "Caleb," I said softly, "you haven't lost your mother. You've only lost trust. And when you're brave enough to find it again, I'll be here." He lifted his head, lips trembling, but said nothing. In those eyes empty, but shifting, I saw a faint spark flicker in the dark. Then he lowered his head, clutching Howard's letter, and collapsed into his arms. I heard a strangled cry, not loud, but heavy as a confession. David stepped beside me and gently set a hand on my shoulder. He didn't speak, he just opened his case and took out the minutes. "I'll sign, Mrs. Norma," he said quietly. "Today's record will be filed at the notary with full witnesses and a video copy. Everything is lawful." I nodded. His pen scratched a firm line. The dry sound felt like a chapter closing. I looked around the gleaming glass walls, the long, cold table, the leather chairs. Howard once chose one by one. They had been symbols of success. Now they were witnesses to a family's collapse. Caleb didn't move. David started toward him, but I shook my head. Leave him. He needs time. We left the room. As the door shut, the only sound behind it was my son's ragged breathing, or the breathing of the man I used to call my son. The corridor was empty. Neon lights threw my shadow long across the floor like a faded streak. I stopped before Howard's photo at the end of the hall, him in a hard hat, grinning wide on a job site. I whispered, "You taught me that justice doesn't need to shout. Today I did it, so why does my heart still feel this heavy?" David stood beside me, silent for a few seconds, then said, "Because you're not the winner, Norma, you're the survivor." That sentence hit me like an honest truth. Yes, I wasn't happy, I wasn't satisfied. I only felt compassion for a man led by blind love, for a woman who lost her humanity to ambition, and for myself, the one who had to watch everything fall apart to protect what's right. We went back to the boardroom after staff finished cleaning. Caleb was still there, asleep over the letter. I gently laid a thin blanket over his shoulders. Then I spoke softly, knowing he couldn't hear me. "Go find yourself again, Caleb. When you can love without trying to possess, when you can live without leaning on power, that's when you'll truly be a Whitmore." David packed the files, placing everything neatly in his case. He looked at me and gave a small smile. "It's all over." I shook my head and sighed. "No, David, I have a feeling there's more, a part of the will we haven't read." He paused, frowned. "What do you think it is?" I looked at the cedar box sitting on the table. The light on its lid made it glow as if it were hiding something. I spoke quietly, almost like the wind. "Howard never left things half done. If he wrote direct blood heir, then there's someone else." David nodded slightly, his face growing. Thoughtful. The rain had just stopped. A late sunset spilled into the room, stretching across the table like a band of light dividing past and present. I spoke softly, almost like a promise to myself. "Tomorrow, we'll open the rest of that box." The next morning, Atlanta's sky was startlingly clear. After last night's rain, sunlight cut through every pane of glass at Whitmore & Co., laying warm strips of light across the floors, as if the city were breathing again after a long sleep. I arrived earlier than everyone else and stepped into the old boardroom, the place that had witnessed the collapse of lies and, maybe today, would open something new. The cedar box was still there, centered on the table. The air carried a faint, dry scent of wood. I touched the lid and felt my palm warm, as if it held the breath of someone gone. Howard used to say, "Every structure, whether steel or human, needs to be finished at the right time." I thought, today is that time. David walked in with a fresh stack of files and the familiar leather case. There was something different in his eyes, no longer just my attorney, but a man watching a long journey reach completion. "Mrs. Norma," he said slowly, "today I want you to meet someone I believe Howard had in mind when he wrote the last part of the will." I looked at him, my heart suddenly beating faster. "Who is it?" David gave a small nod. He turned to the door and gestured. The door opened. A woman walked in. She was about 49, slim but sturdy. Her dark brown hair was pinned up, a few silver strands catching the light and casting small glints around her sun-browned face. She wore a light gray work shirt, a few cement smudges still on her sleeves, and scuffed leather shoes. But it wasn't her appearance that stunned me, it was her eyes. Amber eyes, deep and bright, so steady I had to grip the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. They were Howard's eyes. David's voice broke the tight silence. "Mrs. Norma, this is Ava Pierce, civil engineer, chief supervisor of the Northgate Bridge project." And, he paused, "according to DNA results certified by an independent lab in the state of Georgia, Ava Pierce is the biological daughter of you and Mr. Raisin. Howard Whitmore." The words blew through the room like a gust of wind. I could hear my heartbeat heavy, fast, then hollow. I had to hold onto a chair. "You're saying, biological daughter?" David nodded. "The results match completely with the DNA from the lock of hair in Mr. Howard's box." Ava stood still, her hands clenched. Her eyes left David and turned to me. "I'm sorry," she said, voice tight and shaking. "I don't know where to begin. All my life, I only knew I was adopted by a kind family. They never said anything about my birth parents, just that I was found at the hospital door with a birth certificate missing the last line. I could barely breathe. I remembered Howard's letter, the line he wrote. A young nurse switched the records. My heart ached, and yet I felt a rush of gratitude. At least the baby lived, was loved, and grew up to be good. Ava went on, her voice soft. "I studied engineering, even though no one in my adoptive family worked in the field. I only knew that whenever I crossed a bridge with the name Whitmore, I felt something strange, like my blood was being joined to those steel beams. I didn't know why. I only knew I belonged there. I couldn't hear anything else. My eyes blurred. I walked toward her, each step crossing 49 years of regret. Up close, I saw it, the high bridge of the nose, the firm jawline, the slight left-tilting smile. All of it was Howard. I wanted to say daughter, but my throat closed. I could only murmur, Howard was right. He always said his blood would never disappear from the structures he built, and he was right. Ava smiled faintly as tears slid down her sun-browned cheeks. "I don't dare call you Mom," she said, voice unsteady. "But I think I've spent my whole life working for the people whose blood I carry." David quietly took a seat and let the moment breathe. In that space, time seemed to stop. There was only me and the woman with Howard's eyes. At the far end of the table, Caleb still sat, his face hollowed out. He looked at Ava with a mix of shock and shame. No one spoke. Then he lowered his head. "So, it's you. You're the one who truly belongs to them." Ava turned, her voice gentle as a breeze. "I don't want to take anything from you. I just want to know where I came from and to thank my parents, the ones who raised me even if they didn't give birth to me." Caleb stayed quiet. In that instant, the hatred in his eyes was gone, only release remained, as if the lifelong weight had finally fallen from his shoulders. Jade was still in the hallway, trying to force her way in, yelling, "Something." David signaled security. They held her back. Her heels struck the floor again, but this time it wasn't a threat. It was the hollow sound of someone who'd lost everything. The door closed behind Jade for good. Inside, the board was utterly silent. No one dared speak or move. David said, "Under the final clause of the will, all assets and voting rights of Whitmore & Co. belong to Mrs. Norma and the direct blood heir, Miss Ava Pierce. Miss Pierce may choose to take an executive role or delegate it." Ava looked at me, eyes warm and steady. "I don't want to take anything from you. I just want to help if you'll let me." I took her hand and felt the real warmth of my own blood. "You're not taking anything, Ava. You're giving back what the world stole from us." I pulled her into an embrace. The smells of sweat, cement, and years on job sites clung to her shirt so familiar they made me cry. My tears fell onto my daughter's shoulder and mingled with hers. In that embrace, I could almost hear Howard nearby, smiling gently. "See? My final project was us." David closed the file, his voice low and light. "Whitmore & Co. has passed through 2 generations, 1 betrayal and 1 rebirth. Today we witness the beginning of the 3rd, the generation of Ava." Everyone stood, no applause, no cheers. They only bowed their heads, quiet, respectful, as if at a sacred rite. I looked out the window. The sky was spotless, sunlight washing over the Whitmore & Co. sign until it shone like it had been cleansed after a storm. In my heart, The ruins of the past slowly dissolved, making room for something both new and familiar peace. I whispered, just for me, "Welcome home, Ava. Welcome back, Whitmore." A week after that fateful meeting, the air inside Whitmore & Co. felt different. Hallways that once seemed dust-heavy now glowed with light. Staff nodded as I passed, not because of my title but because they felt it too. The storm had passed, and the company was entering a new season. I stepped into the large boardroom where the board was already seated. At the end of the table, Ava was arranging papers. She wore a white shirt, hair tied back, her face still a little shy but her eyes steady, sure of where she belonged. Beside her was Tessa, the young woman I'd met at the South site. Still simple in dress, pencil smudges and job site dust on her hands, but now bright and confident. David sat to my right, his thick case neatly placed. He gave me a confirming nod everything was ready. I stood. Morning light cut across the glass and lit up the Whitmore & Co. sign behind me until each letter gleamed. "Before we begin," I said, slow and clear, "I want to remind everyone, today isn't just a meeting, it's a day of passing on a legacy." The room went quiet. Every eye turned to me. I looked around the faces and stopped at Ava. Under Mr. Howard Whitmore's will, legally confirmed and filed, Miss Ava Pierce is the sole direct blood heir of the Whitmore line. A soft murmur rose, then faded when I lifted my hand. I went on, firm. "Therefore, I officially declare, Ava Pierce will receive all shares and voting rights as provided in the will." Ava bowed slightly, her hand tightening. I saw her eyes shine, but she didn't cry. She only smiled a smile exactly like Howard's when he landed his first contract. I paused, then spoke more slowly, as if to myself as well. "But I want this to be clear to everyone in this room. Blood is the beginning, but ability is what endures." The line carried, unhurried, but strong enough to etch itself into the air. This company no longer exists just to protect the Whitmore name. It exists to keep the principle Howard carved into the wall of our first office. Build what's right, not what's easy. Build what's right, and the big things will follow. I nodded to David. He opened his case and pulled a new packet. "Allow me to present the new leadership structure proposed by Mrs. Norma." All eyes followed as I spoke. "Starting today, Whitmore & Co. will operate under a 3-leader model. I, Norma Whitmore, Executive Chair; Ava Pierce, Chief Operating Officer; and Tessa Cole, Chief Executive Officer." A ripple of surprise moved through the room, not resistance but wonder, maybe even respect. I continued. "The reason is simple. Ava has technical experience, roots in the trade, and Whitmore blood. She understands the value of labor and carries the discipline of someone who's worked on a job site. As for Tessa, she has youth, vision, and, above all, the ethics our industry is losing." I glanced at Tessa. She gave a small nod, eyes shining. Ava looked over at her, and they shared a simple smile between them. Something rare. Respect. David outlined the terms. "This structure is fully lawful. The will empowers Mrs. Norma to delegate governance to the rightful heir. The board will vote to ratify now." Hands went up one by one. No votes against. I drew a long breath. A lightness I hadn't felt in years rose inside me. The meeting moved to the part I'd been waiting for. I stood and opened the folder I'd prepared over many late nights. On the cover, "Whitmore Homes, a legacy rebuilt." "I have a project to announce," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet. "It's called Whitmore Homes, Affordable Housing for Workers and Low-Income Families." A few board members whispered. I smiled. "This won't bring big profits. But it will bring back trust, and that's what construction lacks most. We've built some of this city's tallest buildings. Now it's time to build what we can be proudest of." Sturdy homes for the people who sweat to make them. I turned to Ava. You'll oversee scholarships and job site safety so no one in our ranks has to trade a life for a paycheck. Then to Tessa. You'll lead design and construction. I want you to teach the whole crew the line you told me. Build what's right first, and the big will come after. She smiled, eyes bright as steel in the sun. I promise, Mrs. Norma. And I think Mr. Howard would be proud. Ava nodded, palm on the plan. I think so too. He dreamed of a company that isn't just for getting rich, but for doing right. I looked at the two of them, one young, one seasoned, and felt Howard between them, present in every breath. A week later, our internal journal put out a special issue. The front page showed Ava and Tessa standing beside me, the headline, "The New Era of Whitmore and Co. Legacy Rebuilt." Below it was my quote, "We aren't starting from zero but from values we forgot. Buildings can fall, companies can be lost, but the right principles can't be destroyed." Major papers ran the story too. Some called me the last woman of the honest construction generation. Others said I was the stubborn old lady who saved a company from greed. I just smiled. I don't need titles. I only want Howard to know his legacy didn't die with him. That evening, when the office was quiet, I stood alone in my room. Howard's photo caught the sunset. In it, he was smiling, simple, hopeful. I said softly, "See, Howard? Ava came home. And Tessa, she's like me when I was young, only a bit tougher." I paused, looking out the window. Far off, the new site had begun to stir. Cranes moved, yellow lights washed over hard hats. Steel rang on steel, not the cold sound of ambition, but the heartbeat of renewal. I turned back to the photo and smiled. I kept my promise, Howard. Not just protecting the company, but giving it back the heart we once put in. And you know what? I touched the glass. I can see you smiling. That afternoon, the Atlanta sky looked dipped in pale honey. Sunlight slid through the old office window onto the faded lines of the first drawing Howard sketched by. Ava and I sat side by side at his desk, the oak still scarred from the days when the company had only 2 employees, me and my husband. Ava traced a fingertip over the corner of the page where Howard had written in blue ink, "If you build it with love, it will last longer than steel." She smiled and whispered, "Now I know why he chose this work." Warmth and bitterness rose together in me. "You know," I began. He drew that in a rented kitchen in Decatur. That night he set a kerosene lamp in the middle of the table, and I wrote down every measurement he read aloud. We had nothing but a dream and 2 calloused hands. "This desk is the foundation of our entire life." Ava looked at me, as if she wanted to memorize every word. "And you? You never thought you'd sit here again? After everything?" I let out a small laugh and shook my head. "No, I thought it all ended when Howard died. But life is strange, Ava. What seems lost can return in another, form through you." She was quiet, her smile trembling. "You know, when I was little, I didn't understand why my heart raced every time I saw the Whitmore logo. In high school, a teacher showed a video about the first Whitmore Bridge. When the name came up, I burst into tears. I didn't know why, only that it felt like a memory I couldn't remember. I set my hand on her shoulder, light enough, and felt my throat burn. Maybe because the soul knows where it belongs, even when the mind doesn't. We talked through the afternoon. Her story was a childhood in a small house near Augusta, adoptive parents who were carpenters. They taught her to keep her word, to face flaws and fix them with her hands. "Maybe that's why," she said, "I love construction. I'm not great at talking, but I understand how to make something stand." I laughed. "You're more like your father than I imagined." Then we spoke about Caleb. We didn't avoid it. We didn't blame. I just told the truth. I told her about the little boy who ran around job sites calling Howard his hero, about the man who lost himself by marrying the wrong person and chose silence instead of facing the truth. Ava listened without judgment. When I finished, she laid her hand over mine. "Mom, forgiveness is building too. It's just that we don't stack bricks, we stack mercy." I lifted my eyes to my daughter's amber gaze, still clear as the first moment I met her. For the first time, someone called me Mom, in a voice so peaceful. No blame, no hesitation, only love. I cried not from pain, but from release. 49 years of waiting, just to hear that word. A late mom, but the medicine for every wound that remained. After that day, I lost sleep for many nights, not from haunting, but thinking about what Ava said. Forgiveness is building. I remembered Caleb's eyes at the end of the meeting, empty, but with a faint spark. I knew if we didn't close that wound, the past would press on all of us forever. So I decided I wanted to see Caleb, not to settle assets, but to end the hatred. David objected at first. He was afraid I'd be hurt again. But I only said, "David, there are wounds no one else can stitch for you. You have to touch them yourself if you want them to heal." The therapy center where Caleb was staying sat in the northern suburbs. I drove there on a spring morning, peach blossoms lining both sides of the road. The air was light. The scent of flowers and pine made me oddly calm. When the nurse led me into the therapy room, Caleb was by the window, looking out at the garden. He was thinner, gray beginning at his temples, eyes deep set. I stood there a few seconds, unsure where to begin. Then he turned, and for the first time in years, there was no anger in his eyes. "Hi, Mom." His voice was hoarse, but clear. I sat across from him, steadying my breath. "How are you?" I asked. He shrugged with a tired smile. "I'm learning how to breathe. They teach me to breathe before I talk. I used to talk to hide, not to understand." I stayed quiet. A breeze lifted the white curtain. Sunlight trembled across my hands. Caleb looked at me and said softly, "I read Dad's letter every day." He wasn't angry at me. He just cared. I nodded, tears gathering. "Your father never stopped caring. For me, for you." He lowered his head, fingers laced tight. "I'm sorry. Not just for the company, for making you live with a pain I didn't understand." I took his hand. "No, son, I'm at fault too. I stayed silent too long and made you believe love was something you had to beg for." He looked up, eyes wet. "You still call me your son? After everything?" I smiled faintly. "Blood isn't the only thing that makes a child, Caleb. Love does too. And I've loved you long enough that it can't be lost." We sat in silence, listening only to the wind threading through the leaves. That moment needed no explanation, no signatures. Just two people who had weathered too much loss, sitting across from each other, breathing together. When I left the center, the sun was blazing gold. I pulled over by the roadside and looked into the rearview mirror. Down the long road behind me, the trees on both sides intertwined into an arch, like a bridge. A simple bridge, but steady, as firm as the invisible thread that was stitching the cracked souls of my family back together. I spoke softly to myself, as if Howard could hear. "We've built it at last, you know, the final bridge made of forgiveness, not concrete." I turned the car toward the Whitmore & Co. building. In the distance, under the sunlight, crews were breaking ground on the first foundations of the Whitmore Homes project. Hammers rang out, steady and bright, like the heartbeat of life. A light feeling rose in me, soft as wind. An old chapter had closed, and a new foundation had begun. I once thought that after meeting with Caleb and Ava's return, the last storm had passed. But I forgot one thing: people who live by lies never leave quietly. 2 months later, on a Monday morning, I opened the paper and saw my name plastered across the front page. An old photo of me at Howard's funeral had been spliced beside a giant headline: "Old Whitmore woman strips her son of inheritance, fabricates a story to seize assets." The story ran on a tabloid site, but spread like wildfire. They wrote that I was senile, that I envied a young, beautiful daughter-in-law, and fabricated an adoption story to take back control of the company. Other outlets piled on. Local TV stations started calling my office for exclusive interviews. I understood immediately. Jade's hand. Stripped of money and reputation, she had chosen her last weapon: dirty media. David called me that same morning. His voice was calm, but inside it was cold steel. "Mrs. Norma, don't worry," I figured. "She'd do this. We have evidence, and this time we won't just defend, we'll counterattack." He arrived at my office an hour later with a thick file. "These are all the legal records of the DNA test, a certified copy of the original will, and notarized documents. I've also contacted the court to file a defamation and organized slander suit against Jade Whitmore." I looked at him and asked quietly, "Do you think the public will believe us, David?" He smiled. "Justice doesn't always win on television, Norma, but it always wins in the case file." 3 days later, David held a small press conference. No fanfare, no stage. Just a simple meeting room at Whitmore & Co. In front of us were the same reporters who'd come to dig up dirt the week before, now sitting quietly, waiting. David stepped to the podium, opened the file, and spoke with perfect composure. "We don't answer with rumors, we answer with facts. Here is the DNA test issued by the state lab of Georgia confirming that Mr. Caleb Whitmore has no biological relation to Mrs. Norma Whitmore. And here are the handwritten pages, signature, and notarized video of Mr. Howard Whitmore, her husband, validating his will 6 months before he passed." He laid each piece of evidence on the table, one document at a time, each stamped in red. No reporter dared interrupt. Then David continued, voice cool as metal. "We have also filed suit against Mrs. Jade Whitmore for organized defamation and dissemination of false information intended to damage reputation and obstruct company operations. All data for the hired media accounts and payments for the posts have been verified through the bank." A reporter stood and asked softly, "Mrs. Norma, would you like to say anything?" I rose and smiled evenly. "Only this. Justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be certain. And we have that." The news flipped in just 2 days. Outlets that had spread the lies took their stories down. Local stations issued apologies. A major magazine ran a feature with the headline, "A 69-year-old woman holds the line on justice and integrity. The true legacy of the Whitmore family." It recounted my journey from the wife who poured foundations with her husband, to the mother wounded by betrayal, and finally the guardian of a legacy through wit and humanity. I read it in silence, feeling not pride, but relief. As if I'd restored honor not just to myself, but to Howard. A week later, Caleb sent me a brown envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, the script shaky but clear. "Mom, I read everything the papers wrote and I'm ashamed. Not because they smeared you, but because I ever let others do it for me. I'm continuing therapy. I know I don't deserve the Whitmore name, but I'll try to become the man you and Dad believed I could be. I'm not asking to come back only for forgiveness. Caleb." I read each line slowly, the ink blurring with tears. I didn't write back. I placed the letter in Howard's cedar box, where the pain and repentance of my family would be buried for good. The next month, I announced the Howard Foundation, a nonprofit to help underprivileged youth learn the construction trades and job site safety. At the launch, I said, "Howard used to say, 'Don't just build houses, build people,' and that's what I want to keep doing for him." Ava took the helm. She visited trade schools, awarded scholarships, and held ethics workshops. She spoke to students with the voice of someone who came up from the dirt, not from a pedigree. And Tessa, the young woman once standing in a cloud of sight dust, now led 3 major Whitmore Homes projects. She worked relentlessly, holding to the same creed: build what's right first, and the big will follow. Those words convinced me the next Whitmore generation would be not just skilled, but right. Ava also signed a transparency charter with the board, something our company had never had. Every contract, expense, and bid would be visible internally. At the first meeting, she said, "Transparency doesn't weaken us, it makes us stronger, because everyone can see exactly what we're building." I sat listening, strangely proud. Howard would have smiled at this. Not because the company was growing, but because the spirit he left behind had finally found its bearer. And Jade? The defamation hearing ended in 40 minutes. The evidence was overwhelming. She lost, had to pay all legal costs, and issue a public apology. But the press no longer cared. People were tired of her face. 2 weeks later, she left the city. No one knows where. Her name vanished from the news like the last echo of a storm, fading to nothing. A year later, Whitmore & Co. posted its strongest growth in a decade. But what made me happiest wasn't the numbers, it was the look in workers' eyes as they received the first apartment keys at Whitmore Homes. They took photos, smiling wide before a small house with a pale blue awning. On the wall, a plaque read, "Dedicated to Howard and Norma Whitmore, who built homes, not just buildings." I stood before it, feeling an uncanny peace. I understood that, in the end, justice had arrived not with a shout, but with results. That night, I returned to the office and switched on Howard's old desk lamp. Warm light fell over his framed photo on the wall. I looked at that smile and said softly, "See, Howard? Justice never needed to be loud, only certain. And now it lives in every brick and every person here." I closed my eyes and listened to the night wind rustle through the buildings we raised. In that sound, I thought I heard Howard's voice, gentle, low, barely above a whisper. "You kept your promise, Norma. You rebuilt it all with justice and with love." That morning, Atlanta's sky was startlingly clear. Not a cloud, just soft light across the freshly finished buildings at the Whitmore home site. I stood in the main hall of headquarters, where we held the in-house ceremony I called the transfer rite. No fireworks, no gaudy banners. Only white magnolias. Howard's flowers from our first opening day and rows of yellow hard hats set neatly on a wooden dais, the emblem of the lives we built. People stood quietly in rows. The air held a simple solemnity, more a tribute to labor than a celebration of power. I stepped to the lectern, laid my hand on the mic, and spoke evenly, not loud, but clear enough for all. I've lived nearly 70 years, and more than 40 of them with Howard, the man who taught me that true legacy doesn't sit in a safe, it lives in how we treat people. I paused, looking around the room. Faces came into focus, some gray-haired, some barely out of school, but all with the same pride in their eyes. We've weathered storms. There were days I thought Whitmore & Co. would exist only in memory, but today I see what we once lost trust. And if Howard were here, I believe he'd tell us this: when you build with your heart, that work will not fall. No one spoke. Only the wind at the window, carrying the scent of wood and fresh paint, the familiar scent of our earliest years. I smiled. So today, I'm not handing over titles or power. I'm handing over a promise that this legacy will continue, with your hands, your minds, and your hearts. I stepped back and gave the floor to Ava. Ava walked up. She wore a beige shirt, hair pinned high, and the old company badge of Howard I'd given her. She looked around the hall, her voice trembling. I want to read a letter. Not to the board, but to the people who built all of this with us. She unfolded a carefully folded page and read, voice light as a breeze. Dear aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, and every worker who has stood with Whitmore & Co. I wasn't born into this family, but today I know I belong to it. Every brick, every yard of concrete, every bridge you've built carries my father's name, Howard, and now my mother's, Norma. But I believe that name doesn't belong to them alone. It belongs to all of us. Thank you for not leaving when the company was in trouble. Thank you for believing we could rebuild. And thank you for letting me be part of this legacy. When she looked up, I saw people in the front rows quietly wiping their eyes. Ava set the letter down, her voice steadying. Now, I'd like to hand the mic to the person I believe will carry Whitmore & Co. farther than fame, Tessa Cole. Tessa stepped forward, strong and sure. The morning sight dust still clung faintly to her sleeves. Mrs. Norma, everyone, she began, firm and clear. I'm not great at speeches, but I know this. We're going to build things that outlast reputation. Reputation is what people say about us. Our structures are what we leave for them. Applause rolled through the hall. I saw David in the back row, smile and nod. He'd always believed this company would find its soul again, and now he could see it. Right after, the board signed the Whitmore Charter, a document we drafted together over weeks, 12 commitments to safety, dignity, and transparency in labor. I wrote the final line by hand. No profit is worth the price of a worker's health or self-respect. When that sentence went to print, I knew Howard would be proud. It was the same thing he'd said back when we were just 2 hands on a tiny site. A roof lasts only when it's raised by honest hands. The ceremony neared its close. I stood once more with the key to the safe I'd carried for 40 years. Inside, I said, my voice rough, is the first bridge design Howard ever drew. It spans a small river in Tennessee, not big, not beautiful, but it's where everything began. I want to pass it to Ava and Tessa. From now on, new bridges will be built by the next 2 generations. I placed the tap list key in Ava's hand. Just then, a ray of sunlight slanted through the glass and lit Howard's photo on the wall. I stopped. In that light, I could almost see him at the back of the hall, warm eyes, gentle smile, hands in his pockets, nodding at me. I didn't say it out loud. I only nodded back, answering, I did it, Howard. At that moment, a staff member came forward and set a bouquet of white flowers on the dais. Mrs. Norma, these arrived this morning. No card, just a small note. I bent to read it. On the slip, in Caleb's familiar hand, thank you for still calling me your son. I closed my fingers around the paper, eyes blurring. In my heart, the answer whispered back, you never lost your mother, Caleb, never. The ceremony ended with a wave of applause rolling through the hall. Not wild, not noisy, slow, sincere, like the heartbeat of people who know they're witnessing both an ending and a beginning. I stepped back to stand beside Ava and Tessa. Looking around, I saw every face clearly in the midday light. Those who had known loss and betrayal, even those who once doubted now standing on the same side. Outside the glass, crews in hard hats kept raising the 5th story of the community housing. Hammers, steel, and wind blended into the only soundtrack I've ever needed. I closed my eyes and drew a long breath. No more anger, no more fear. Only quiet peace, the greatest reward for a life spent holding to what's right. Somewhere inside I heard a warm voice, distant and close all at once. You can rest now, Norma. I smiled, eyes still shut, letting the light wash through my lashes, warm and gentle as my husband's embrace. On the first morning of the next fall, Ava and I walked the site of Whitmore & Co.'s new bridge. It was a small span, only a few hundred meters, but it meant more than anything we'd ever built. This bridge would link a poor neighborhood in the south of the city to the center, the place people still say the American dream begins. Early wind blew through, carrying the scents of new steel, wood, and damp earth still holding dew. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply that familiar smell of what truly lasts, not because of money, but because of sweat, faith, and patience. Ava walked beside me with a rolled plan in her hand, hair loosening in the breeze. She stopped, looked out at the crews, setting the first girders, and asked softly, "Mom, what's the strongest structure, in your opinion?" I smiled, watching the hands moving under the sun. "The human heart, honey. No material endures like trust and love. Steel will corrode, concrete will crack, but the heart, if it's built the right way, will stand 100 years. Ava nodded, smiling. In the pale morning light, she looked more like Howard than ever. Not in her face, but in her eyes. Eyes of someone who believes everything can be rebuilt, even after collapse. I lifted my gaze to the memorial plaque by the riverbank, where Howard's image was engraved. "Darling," I spoke quietly inside, "I've forgiven you. Not because you were right, but because I understand that love sometimes leads us to choose the wrong means to protect the right thing. You brought me a child, not of my blood, but of my heart. And that child, together with the daughter we lost, made your legacy whole. I forgave Caleb too. Not with words, but with actions, by keeping his name in the family record, by placing his letter in the cedar box beside Howard's, because I know that mistakes are part of growing up. And sometimes the price of learning mercy is tears." On the site, Tessa reviewed the steel frame with the chief engineer. She stood tall, sunlight bright on her sun-browned face, eyes lit with conviction. Ava stepped over to sign the 10-year plan for community infrastructure, a plan written by 2 generations together. I stood behind them, feeling light as air. Howard had dreamed of this day, when real people would keep building real things, not for fame, not for power, but for the pride of creating something useful for others. I took out my notebook and wrote the final entry, my hand unsteady, my heart steady. Tomorrow we pour the smallest bridge's foundation, the bridge between generations. On one side, a past at peace. On the other, a future built firm on trust. Ava turned back and smiled. "Mom, I think Howard is smiling." I looked at her, then at our reflections in the site trailer's glass. One tall, one shorter, blending like 2 halves of the same soul. Autumn wind carried the clink of steel and the rhythm of hammers, steady as a heartbeat. Maybe that's the sound of life going on, the sound of what endures, even when we're no longer here to see it. That afternoon, I sat in my small office, looking out over the site. Sunset poured down, tinting everything with warm bronze. I opened the old journal whose first page was written in 1981, when the company had only 4 people and a dream. On the last page today, I added one more line. "Howard, I kept our legacy, not the buildings, but the people who can stand firm in a storm." And if anyone asks me what the greatest legacy of a life is, I'll say this: the trust passed down from one person to the next. I closed the journal, my heart at rest. Outside, the wind carried workers' laughter and the crackle of welding blending into a familiar music, the song of a life, of justice, of kindness preserved across generations. Night fell. I stepped onto the balcony and looked down at the site. Yellow lights spread out, mirrored by the river beneath the bridge sparkling like 1,000 stars. I whispered, to myself and to anyone who had ever listened to my story. In the end, life isn't measured by what we have, but by what we leave for others. And in that moment, I knew my legacy won't live only in Whitmore and Co., but in every heart that believes this. The right thing is always worth building, even if you have to start again from the rubble. If you've stayed with me to the end, thank you, from the bottom of my heart. I am a woman who lost a husband, a child, and her good name, then found herself among the ruins. I'm not special. I'm just someone who believes the right thing never goes out of style, and mercy still has a place even in the coldest rooms. What about you? When you look back on your life, what does legacy mean to you? Is it blood, wealth, or what you leave for others, the hands you've held, the people you helped stand again after the storm? I truly want to hear your story. Share it in the comments because sometimes one honest story can warm someone who's lost. And if you believe, as I do, that justice and kindness still exist, please like, subscribe, and stay with me as we keep telling stories of trust, love, and homes that can stand through every gale.